Where did the copper come from? The copper that Thomas Edison buried beneath the streets of lower Manhattan in iron conduit insulated with beeswax, the copper that George Westinghouse strung on overhead poles at 3,000 volts and that killed the lineman who climbed those poles without knowing which wire was which, the copper that Alexander Graham Bell wound into the coils of the first telephone and that Samuel Morse strung across the eastern United States to carry the telegraph signals that connected the country before the railroad did, the copper that wired the factories and the streetcars and the power stations and the arc lights and the switchboards and the transformers and the motors that made the electrical age possible. That copper came from rock. Billion-year-old basalt, volcanic rock from the Portage Lake volcanic series, laid down by eruptions that predated the existence of multicellular life on the planet. The rock contained small pockets and veins of native copper, pure metallic copper that had been deposited in the vesicles and fractures of the lava flows as hydrothermal fluids circulated through the cooling rock over geological time. The copper was in the rock. The rock was in the ground. The ground was the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a narrow finger of land jutting into Lake Superior, where the richest deposit of native copper on the continent lay within a few miles of the largest freshwater lake on the planet. To get the copper out of the rock, you had to crush the rock. To crush the rock, you needed a machine. The machine was called a stamp mill. The stamp mills of the Keweenaw Peninsula are still standing on the shore of Lake Superior. Their foundations, their walls, their smokestacks, their terraced concrete platforms are still visible along the lakefront and on the banks of Torch Lake and the Keweenaw Waterway. The Quincy Stamp Mill on the shore of Torch Lake near Lake Linden, built between 1888 and 1900, is a ruin of concrete and brick and rusted steel standing on a foundation of the very tailings it produced. The Wolverine and Mohawk Mills at Gay, on the eastern shore of the Keweenaw, overlooking Lake Superior, operated 6 massive Nordberg stamps that crushed ore 24 hours a day and flushed the waste directly into the lake, creating a black sand beach of copper-laden tailings that is still growing, still migrating down the shoreline, still burying the fish spawning grounds at Buffalo Reef more than a century after the last stamp dropped. The Champion Mill, also known as the Mass Mill, sat on the shore of Keweenaw Bay and operated from 1902 to 1919, its tailings dispersed as a dual pulse of fine slime, clay, and coarse stamp sands that spread across the bay and onto the Lance Indian Reservation lands of the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community. The Calumet and Hecla mills, the largest milling operation in the copper country, dumped their tailings into Torch Lake for decades, turning one of the deepest and clearest lakes in the Upper Peninsula into a Superfund site whose benthic community, the entire ecosystem of organisms that live on and in the lake bottom, has been destroyed. I went looking for the machines that crushed the copper out of the rock. What I found was a chain of industrial ruins stretching along 50 miles of Lake Superior shoreline, buildings the size of cathedrals, built on terraced concrete platforms at the water's edge, connected to the mines in the spine of the peninsula by narrow-gauge railroads, powered by steam engines burning coal that was shipped in from the lower Great Lakes, processing rock that was 1 billion years old and producing the metal that wired the 19th century, and dumping the waste, 64 million metric tons of it, directly into the water that they drew their processing water from. The machines that wired America are rusting on the shore of the lake they poisoned. Indigenous people mined copper on the Keweenaw Peninsula for more than 8,000 years before the first European explorer arrived. They used stone hammers and fire to extract native copper from surface exposures and shallow pits. The copper was fashioned into tools, weapons, ornaments, and trade goods that have been found across eastern North America, as far south as the Gulf Coast and as far east as the Atlantic seaboard. The scale of the indigenous copper trade was not understood until the 19th century, when archaeological investigations revealed thousands of mining pits along the Copper Range, some of them 20 feet deep, dug with stone tools by people who had identified and exploited the copper deposits thousands of years before the arrival of the geology that would eventually be called the Portage Lake Volcanic Series. The industrial copper mining era began in 1844 and continued until 1968. In those 124 years, the mines of the Keweenaw produced more than 11 billion pounds of copper. For a significant portion of that period, between 1845 and 1887, the Keweenaw Peninsula produced more copper than any other place in the world. The copper ore that came out of the mines was not pure copper. It was rock, basalt, with small inclusions of native copper scattered through it, sometimes in veins, sometimes in masses, sometimes in tiny amygdaloidal pockets no larger than a pea. The copper content of the ore varied from a few percent in the richest sections to fractions of a percent in the poorer rock. To extract the copper, the rock had to be crushed to a particle size small enough that the copper grains were liberated from the surrounding basalt and could be separated by gravity because copper is roughly 3 times denser than the host rock. The crushing was done by stamp mills. The stamp mill was the single most important piece of surface equipment in the Keweenaw copper industry. Without it, the ore that the miners blasted and hauled and hoisted to the surface through shafts nearly 2 miles long was worthless. The stamp mill was where the value was extracted. The mine produced rock. The stamp mill produced copper. If you have been following this channel, you saw the Nordberg steam hoist at the Quincy mine that pulled the ore from 2 miles underground. This is what happened to that ore after it reached the surface. Subscribe if you want to see where the next thread leads. A stamp mill operated on a principle that had not changed fundamentally since the ancient Greeks used it to pound grain. A heavy weight was lifted by a rotating cam and then dropped under gravity onto the material to be crushed. The difference between a Greek grain stamp and a Keweenaw copper stamp was scale. The stamps in the Keweenaw mills weighed more than 800 pounds each. Some of the later Nordberg steam stamps weighed considerably more. They were made of heavy iron or steel, shod with hardened steel shoes at the bottom, and mounted vertically in a frame called a battery. A horizontal camshaft, driven by a steam engine through a system of gears and belts, rotated beneath the stamps. As each cam lobe passed beneath a stamp, it lifted the stamp to the top of its stroke, roughly 12 to 20 inches. As the cam rotated past the stamp fell under its own weight onto the ore below with a force proportional to its mass and the height of the drop. The impact crushed the rock against a hardened steel plate called the die at the bottom of the battery box, also known as the mortar box. Water was continuously pumped into the battery box from Lake Superior or Torch Lake through intake pipes, creating a slurry of crushed rock and water that flowed out through screens in the side of the mortar box and onto the next stage of the processing line. The stamps dropped at a rate of 90 to 150 times per minute per stamp, in a repeating rhythm that was audible for miles across the water. 6 stamps dropping 150 times per minute is 900 impacts per minute, 54,000 impacts per hour, every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months and years without stopping. The sound of a stamp mill in full operation was a continuous, thundering, percussive roar that shook the ground beneath the building, rattled the windows of the workers' boarding houses nearby, and carried across the surface of the lake to the communities on the opposite shore. Residents of the Keweenaw described the sound as the heartbeat of the peninsula. It was the sound of employment. It was the sound of wages. When the stamp stopped, the peninsula was silent. The silence meant the mill was down. The mill being down meant the miners were out of work. Nobody in the copper country wanted to hear silence. The men who worked inside the stamp mills operated in conditions that were distinct from the dangers of the underground mine, but no less brutal. The noise inside the mill building was so intense that workers could not hear each other speak. Communication was by hand signal. Prolonged exposure to the stamp percussion caused permanent hearing damage that was universal among mill workers and was considered an occupational inevitability rather than an injury. The vibration from the stamps transmitted through the concrete foundations and into the floor, through the workers' boots and into their bones. Mill workers developed chronic joint pain and spinal compression from years of standing on vibrating surfaces for 10 to 12-hour shifts. The air inside the mill was saturated with fine rock dust and water mist. a combination that coated the workers' lungs with silica particles suspended in moisture. The stamp mill workers breathed this air for the duration of their shifts. They were not provided with respiratory protection. The concept of respiratory protection in an industrial workplace did not exist in the 19th century Keweenaw. The workers who survived decades in the stamp mills developed the same chronic respiratory disease that the underground miners developed from breathing drill dust, the disease that the medical literature would later call silicosis, and that the workers called miners' consumption or simply a bad chest. Each stamp mill contained multiple batteries, and each battery contained multiple stamps. The Wolverine and Mohawk mills at Gay operated 6 Nordberg stamps between them, coal-fueled, steam-powered, capable of crushing enormous quantities of ore per day. The Quincy Stamp Mill on Torch Lake was built in 2 phases. The first mill completed in 1894, and the second added in 1900 to keep pace with the output of the Quincy mine, which by the early 1900s was the deepest and most productive copper mine in the Keweenaw. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, the largest operator in the copper country, ran multiple mills simultaneously, acquiring the Ahmeek Mill, the Tamarack Mills, the Osceola Mills, and the Centennial Mill through its aggressive program of buying out competing mining companies across the peninsula. At the peak of the industry, the combined milling capacity of the Keweenaw stamp mills processed hundreds of thousands of tons of ore per year. The stamp mills were built at the water's edge for a specific reason. The crushing and separation process required enormous volumes of water. Water was pumped from the lake or river into the mill through intake pipes that, in some cases, extended hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the lake. The water was mixed with the crushed ore to create the slurry that moved through the successive stages of the separation process. After the stamps crushed the rock, the slurry passed through trommels, cylindrical rotating screens that sorted the crushed material by particle size. The sorted material then flowed across a series of jigs, gravity separation devices that used a pulsating stream of water to separate the denser copper particles from the lighter waste rock. The mills at Gay operated 140 jigs between them. After the jigs, finer material passed across Wilfley tables, vibrating inclined surfaces covered with a thin film of flowing water that separated the finest copper particles from the remaining waste. The copper concentrate that emerged from the jigs and the tables was collected and shipped by rail to smelters, the Quincy smelter at Ripley, or the Coles Creek smelter operated by Copper Range west of Houghton, where it was melted down into ingots of pure copper for sale and shipment to the fabricators and wire mills of the lower Midwest and the eastern seaboard. The waste, the material that was not copper, the crushed basalt, the fine sand and silt that the separation process had stripped of its metal content, had to go somewhere. The stamp mills solved the disposal problem with the simplest possible method. They washed it into the lake. A system of launders, wooden or steel channels through which the waste slurry flowed by gravity, carried the tailings from the mill to the shoreline and beyond. Belted conveyors extended the discharge point further and further into the water as the tailings pile grew. The waste, known locally as stamp sands, accumulated on the lake bed, on the shoreline, and in the near-shore waters of Lake Superior, Torch Lake, and Keweenaw Bay. Over the 124-year span of industrial copper mining on the Keweenaw Peninsula, the stamp mills discharged more than 64 million metric tons of copper-laden tailings into the coastal waters of Lake Superior. 64 million metric tons. The tailings contain residual copper that the jigs and the Wilfley tables did not recover, along with arsenic, mercury, and other heavy metals that occur naturally in the host rock. The tailing did not stay where they were dumped. The currents and wave action of Lake Superior and the internal dynamics of Torch Lake have been redistributing the stamped sands since the day they were deposited, spreading the contaminated material across an ever-widening area of lake bed and shoreline. The most dramatic visible evidence of the stamped sands is at Gay, Michigan, on the eastern shore of the Keweenaw Peninsula, where the Mohawk and Wolverine mills operated from approximately 1900 to the early 1930s. The tailings from those mills were flushed into Lake Superior through a system of launders and conveyors, whose remains still mark the gay shoreline, rusted iron chutes and concrete pylons, and the stumps of timber conveyor frames standing in the water like the ribs of a shipwreck. The Stamp sands have formed a massive black sand beach that extends for miles along the coast south of the mill sites, a beach unlike any natural beach on Lake Superior. The sand is dark, metallic, heavy in the hand, and visibly different from the natural reddish-brown Jacobsville sandstone beaches of the region. The Stamp sand grains are angular, fractured fragments of billion-year-old basalt that were pulverized by the Stamps and washed through the jigs and flushed into the lake and deposited on the shore by wave action, and they contain enough residual copper to stain the water green in places and enough arsenic and mercury to classify the material as contaminated under federal environmental standards. The Stamp Sand Beach at Gay is one of the most photographed industrial landscapes in the Upper Peninsula, a striking and unsettling visual of industry's legacy, a beach made not by the erosion of rock by water over geological time, but by the crushing of rock by machines over industrial time. The Stamp sands are still migrating southward along the shore, driven by longshore currents and wave action at a rate that has been measured and documented by researchers at Michigan Technological University and the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and they are progressively covering the natural cobble and gravel substrate at Buffalo Reef, one of Lake Superior's most important lake trout and whitefish spawning grounds. The Stamp sands smother the eggs that the fish deposit in the spaces between the gravel cobbles, filling the interstitial voids that the eggs require for oxygenation and development. The fishery biologists who study Buffalo Reef have documented the advancing front of the Stamp sands year by year, mapping the boundary between the natural substrate and the black industrial sand with sonar and underwater cameras. The boundary is moving. The sands are still advancing. The mills that produce them have been closed for nearly a century. The sands do not know that. Torch Lake, where the Quincy Stamp Mill and several of the Calumet and Hecla mills operated, tells a different version of the same story. Torch Lake is a deep, narrow lake, roughly 11 miles long, connected to Portage Lake and the Keweenaw waterway by a channel. From the surface, Torch Lake is beautiful. The water appears clear. The shoreline is lined with trees. Homes and docks line the banks. It looks like any other Upper Peninsula lake on a summer afternoon. It is not. The bottom of Torch Lake is a graveyard. The Stamp mills that operated on its shores dumped their tailings directly into the lake for decades. The tailings settled to the bottom and blanketed the lake bed in a layer of copper-contaminated sediment that has destroyed the benthic community, the entire ecosystem of organisms that live on and in the lake bottom. The benthic community is the foundation of the lake's food chain. Without it, the higher trophic levels, the insects, the small fish, the larger fish, are destabilized. Torch Lake was designated a Superfund site in 1986 under the Environmental Protection Agency's National Priorities List. The contamination includes copper, mercury, arsenic, and lead in concentrations that exceed safe levels by orders of magnitude in the nearshore sediments. An old dredge, the Quincy Dredge, number 2, still sits in the lake near the abandoned Quincy Mill outside Lake Linden, a rusted hulk of a machine that was used during World War II to vacuum copper-bearing tailings from the lake bottom for reprocessing. Because the wartime demand for copper was so extreme that even the waste that the 19th century stamp mills had thrown away contained enough residual metal to be worth dredging up and running through the separation process again. The Quincy Stamp Mill itself is a ruin on the shore of Torch Lake. The first mill was built in 1860, closer to the Quincy mine, but was relocated in the late 1880s because the tailings it was dumping into Portage Lake were threatening shipping channels. The new mill, built between 1888 and 1894 at a cost of $182,000, included a boarding house, a cistern, a dock, and the mill buildings themselves, terraced concrete platforms on which the stamp batteries, the jigs, the trommels, and the Wilfley tables were arranged in a gravity-fed sequence. Ore came in at the top by rail and progressed downward through the stages of crushing and separation, with gravity doing the work of moving the material from one step to the next. A second mill was added in 1900 to handle the increasing output of the Quincy mine, which by then was driving its number 2 shaft deeper every year, producing the ore that the Nordberg steam hoist, the largest steam hoist ever built, would be built to lift. The first mill was shut down after World War I. The second mill closed in 1922. The mine itself closed in 1931. The Stamp Mill buildings stand on the shore of Torch Lake today as concrete and brick ruins, their roofs gone, their walls crumbling, their foundations built on the stamped sands that the mill itself produced and that now form the ground beneath the structure. The mill is standing on its own waste. The Quincy smelter, the next step in the processing chain after the stamp mill, sits across the Keweenaw waterway from Houghton in the community of Ripley. The smelter was built in 1898 on the stamped sands of the old Pewabic Mill, a previous Quincy milling operation whose tailings had been dumped into the Keweenaw waterway and formed a promontory of industrial waste that the company then used as the foundation for its smelter. The smelter operated from 1898 to 1931, and again from 1948 to 1971. The site was designated a Superfund site in 1986, the same year as Torch Lake, and was cleaned up and delisted in 2013. Asbestos was removed from 12 buildings in 2008. One smokestack was taken down the same year because it had become a structural hazard. A fire in 2010 destroyed the carpentry shop. The remaining structures, the reverberatory furnace building, the cupola furnace building, the loading docks, the coal dock, and the shipping wharf, are now owned by the Keweenaw National Historical Park Advisory Commission and are open for public tours. The smelter is the final link in the processing chain that began with the miner's drill at the bottom of the Quincy shaft, 2 miles underground, and ended with ingots of pure copper loaded onto lake boats at the shipping dock and carried across Lake Superior to the wire mills and fabricators that turned the metal into the telegraph wire and the telephone cable and the electrical conductors that wired the 19th and 20th centuries. I started with a question. Where did the copper come from? It came from billion-year-old basalt in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. It was blasted from the rock by miners working by candlelight at the bottom of shafts nearly 2 miles deep, hoisted to the surface by steam-powered hoists the size of factory buildings, carried by narrow-gauge railroad to stamp mills on the shore of Lake Superior and Torch Lake, and crushed by 800-pound iron stamps dropping 90 to 150 times per minute in a thundering rhythm that carried for miles across the water. The crushed rock was separated by gravity in jigs, and on Wilfley tables, the copper concentrate shipped to smelters, and the 64 million metric tons of waste washed into the lake through launders and conveyors and left there where it remains today, migrating along the shoreline, covering spawning grounds, contaminating the sediment of a lake that was designated a Superfund site, killing the bottom of a body of water that looks like a postcard from the surface and is a graveyard underneath. The stamp mills that did this work are still standing on the shore, the Quincy Mill on Torch Lake, the Wolverine and Mohawk ruins at Gay, the Champion Mill foundations on Keweenaw Bay, the Calumet and Hecla mill sites along the waterway. Their concrete platforms and their brick walls and their rusted steel frames are visible from the roads and the trails and the water. The Quincy Dredge No. 2 still sits in Torch Lake. The Stamp Sand Beach at Gay is still growing. The tailings are still moving. The copper that those mills extracted from the rock is in the walls of every building that was wired in the 19th century, in the infrastructure of every city that Edison and Westinghouse and Bell electrified, in the telegraph lines and the telephone cables and the power grids that connected the country. The machines that made that possible are rusting on the shore of the lake that carried the copper to the world and absorbed the waste that the world left behind. The Keweenaw National Historical Park, established in 1992, preserves and interprets the copper mining heritage of the peninsula across multiple sites, including the Quincy Mine, the Quincy Smelter, and the industrial landscapes of the Calumet Unit. The park is free to enter, the ruins are accessible, The stamp sands at Gay are public shoreline. The story is in the rock and the ruins and the water and the sand. Nobody has to take my word for any of it. The evidence is standing on the shore. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how the Mahoning Valley lost 50,000 steel jobs in 5 years and the blast furnaces that employed them are still rotting along the river, that video is on screen now.